So, a couple days ago, I made this mind map, and it is how one can act with intentionality regarding independent study. If you are choosing your own study topics, necessarily you have to have some sort of criteria, and thinking of what to study when you're studying a lot of different topics can be a task that is not necessarily straightforward. If you're only studying one thing, then identifying what you need to study in that particular area can be easy, but if you're studying a lot of things, it's not the same. So, this mind map reflects what I think is a reasonable approach or a reasonable way of thinking about how to approach it. So, the point of study is to develop a worldview, and only to the extent, or this is my opinion, only to the extent that that worldview informs methodology. So, going all the way from left to right, you want to study stuff that develops your worldview and informs methodology. So, this is one of the reasons that highly abstract philosophy is not particularly appealing to me, because I don't think it informs my methodology or the way I live my life in any way, and if it can't do that, then its utility is suspect. Okay, so if the point is to develop a worldview that leads to positive outcomes in terms of methodology, that's a bit of an incomplete answer, because we need to look at two things, and that's in my mind aims and structures. Although I'm not particularly the words aren't particularly important. The word aim and the word structure, but aim is you're evaluating what's normatively important in your worldview, normative being what ought to be done. And so this is largely values, and I believe subjective, although one value that's pretty universal amongst all humans is organizing yourself socially, because we're social beings. And so, just to offer up an example, if you valued liberalism that was a consequence of French Enlightenment thinkers, where you have ideas such as inalienable human rights, distribution of stuff based on merit, and equality of people, then those values would inform what you think ought to be done in terms of perhaps engaging the world politically. And if you value personal growth, then maybe you read a lot. Stuff like that. But since it's subjective, it can't be fleshed out except for the individual. And you're trying to answer the question, what's important, what should you be doing? And it is important to note that not only does your worldview inform your aim is going to inform your worldview. If you're focused on how to develop yourself, you're going to pay attention to different things and you will uptake different information. If a geologist and a botanist both were in a rainforest and they were looking at a waterfall, they would probably notice vastly different things. The geologist noting, the movement of the water, the way it cuts through, perhaps the different types of rock, and the biologist noting the flora and fauna. And so, in the same way, if some things are important to you, you're going to zero in on them. The second thing is structure. So this is more of creating your model of their world. So the aim provides the motivation for your agency. The structure is the map through which you can navigate it. And so you're trying to answer the question, what's going on? How does the world work? And construct models. And it seems to be the case that models are constructed either through evidence and cognition, which I called science, but it can be reframed differently, or through anecdotal association, which I called stories. Largely, this is informed by the way I look at things, the words I chose to use. I like to look for scientific studies, for evidence of that nature to try and circumvent my bias. And But I think the natural hardware of humans are very likely to use stories and anecdotal evidence because pre-access to studies, that was a really effective way of figuring things out. And so, using these two things, or perhaps more, I didn't think of any, but you create models of the world. And it's important to note that these models of the world, after you're done constructing, have to be coherent with previous models. You can't take in new information that's utterly incoherent with what's going on in terms of your models, which means a lot of information is just impossible for us to grasp just because it's not consistent with what we know about the world or what we think we know. If you showed a smartphone to someone from the 1500s, they would have a really hard time learning about it initially just because it's so far out of their understanding of what's going on. And they try and filter it through their current models, which are just hopelessly out of date with modern technology. And then another structure that to keep in mind is the human condition, which is not avoidable unless you're not a human, being one that is going to inform what's going on. So this might be a bias of mine, but I think if you are completely devoid of your study and what it means to be human in some way or another, then that's probably an error of some kind in terms of independent study. Anyways, so once you know your values and you know how you think the world works, then you can synthesize those two to try and create a methodology for how one should navigate the world. If you don't know what you're aiming at, it's really hard, even if you know how to get from A to B. If you don't know that you want to get to B from A, it's difficult. And then if you have no idea what to do to get what you want, it's also difficult. So with these two in mind, then you can have methodology, right? And I broke the methodology up a little bit. It can be broken down a ton of different ways into a ton of different focuses, but I chose one just basic methodology of once you already have multiple models, what thinking looks like in order to get new information to further go back and inform your worldview. You use inference and critical thinking to think your way through models, and use synthesis to combine models or extrapolate information from both that was not available until you had each and could figure it out. And then you also create an environment that is conducive towards supporting a good worldview. And this can be taken a bunch of different ways, but an example would be there's this study that was done with dogs where they taught them to be helpless, and so what they did is they shocked their feet inside a cage, and then they taught them basically that they couldn't escape the shocks, and that eventually got to the point where even if they give them an opportunity to escape, they would just lie down and whimper and just be shocked. Now, that's terrible, but if you extrapolate that to human psychology and you know that learned helplessness is a thing, you try and avoid environments where you're going to experience things that contribute to learned helplessness, which is the appearance of your problems being pervasive, permanent, or personal. If they're pervasive, they extend all areas of your life. If they're permanent, they're immutable, you can't fix them. And if they're personal, it's a consequence of your own failures in terms of agency and not necessarily the environment, so you're blaming yourself. And so if you wanted to avoid this from an ecosystem perspective, there are a few things you can do. You can put in checks that remind you to tell yourself or think your way through problems in such a way that they don't appear to be those three ways, or you could just avoid things that are going to be very, very frustrating. For example. Anyways, that was a long tangent. The second thing I was thinking in terms of methodology is sometimes what you're doing is you already know how to do something, but you're refining it so that you do it really, really, really well. And I put this section on skill building. The whole point is you're trying to, it's not gaining new knowledge, but it's fine-tuning knowledge to the point where you could eventually utilize it to fulfill your values. So if you're acquiring a skill, let's say your values necessitate you earn money, you acquire a skill, you utilize it to make money, it helps you fulfill your values. And to whatever extent you can sharpen the saw and learn the skill better, that's good. And then the third section I put in, this is largely because we are social creatures, and if ideas cannot be used directly to fulfill your values, and they cannot be used to improve your worldview to help you either fulfill your values, then the only other use as social creatures, well, not the only other, but the one I could think of was communication. And so the extent to which you can communicate ideas is in large part, that's how you get use out of ideas. If you spend a lot of time building a knowledge base that isn't necessarily directly useful, the only way you can make it useful, oftentimes, is to communicate it to others in a way that is useful for them. And so this incorporates, there are a few elements, or there are a ton of elements, but I picked three. Design. If your knowledge is not very accessible, then it's not going to spread, which is also a portion of memetics. Your idea has to have qualities of a good spreading idea, otherwise it's not going to spread. And memetics is the application of ideas that apply to genes and genetics to ideas or cultural pieces of information. So an effective gene is one that causes itself to proliferate. An effective, air quotes, meme is something that's good at proliferating. Of course, the word meme has become a meme in today's culture, which is hilarious. And then also fostering community, which ties in with ecosystem. You want to surround yourself with people who are going to both help your worldview development and also help share your values and actualize your ability to fulfill your values. And so when you tie all this model together, it means you're going to be focusing on information that has an end goal in mind, right? But the end goal is going to be, it has to be something that will eventually be useful at the end, but there's a lot of ways to make information useful. It's really important to have a good idea of where you're going and understanding your values, otherwise you're just shooting at random stuff. And then the structure of the information is also important, because if you know exactly what you're shooting at but you can't shoot straight, and if your agency is not effective, then you can't get what you want. And so this is the way I like to think of studying. It's not particularly specific, but largely it can't be specific because values, what you should be aiming at, is contingent on values. This is relevant to two of my other mind maps, I believe, and that's the web model of collecting multiple models, and they all connect like a web and increase flexibility and utility. And it's also relevant to understanding the difference between normative claims and descriptive claims, because what you should be aiming at is a normative claim, and how the world is a descriptive claim. So the structure is descriptive, aim is normative, and so that can help parse that out a bit, but both have to eventually contribute to a change in action or methodology that's substantive. Otherwise, the information's not particularly relevant outside of just being entertaining. Anyways, hope this was entertaining.